guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about methods. Methods are one of the most important core concepts in any programming language. In other languages, they might be called functions. In C#, we would call them methods, simply because they exist inside of this class. And class is something we'll talk about later on. Don't worry about it too much. Other languages may not have this concept of a class, so typically it's called a function. In C# or other object-oriented languages, if there's a class, it's typically called a method. So what is a method? A method is simply just a container for multiple instructions that you want to run that you might want to reuse in multiple places within your application. Methods are very important to understand and use properly. One of the things that we aim to do in programming is to avoid code reuse. So we don't want to be copying and pasting a lot of code. We don't want to be writing the same code multiple times, and methods help us achieve that. So let's take a look. To create a method, the first thing I need to do is I need to be outside of this static void main. A method is a bit of code that waits for you to use it. It doesn't execute automatically. Remember, when we start the program, we're going to start running the commands from here. But we want to write a method outside of this main. So I'll show you how that works. Now make sure we're outside of main, but inside of program. So I'm going to add a couple of lines here to give myself some space. So the first type of method that we're going to add is something very simple. It's going to add some numbers together. That's all it's going to do. It's very simple. To do so, we're going to type private void add numbers, and we're going to put parentheses. After the parentheses, we're going to do curly braces for a code block. Don't worry too much about the word private right now. We'll talk about that soon. Void is what's known as the return type. This method is not going to return any data. All it's going to do is execute whatever code we tell it to and then be finished. It's not going to give us back any value. We'll talk about return types in just a little bit. Add numbers is just the name that we've called the method, very similar to a variable. This is a name that I chose. It could be anything that I want. Then I put two parentheses. In here, I can write any code that I want to execute. But the first thing I want to do is inside of these parentheses, I'm going to declare two variables. I'm going to say int num1 and int num2. This is what's known as the parameters. And you can have as many parameters as you need. Although typically, if you start having methods that have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 parameters, there's probably a better way to design things, but that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But these are called your parameters. So the void is the return type. This is basically like my variable name, but it's my method name. And these are my parameters. All right. So all I want to do is add num1 and num2. So num1 plus num2. And I'm going to stick that inside of a console.writeLine, just so we can see the output. Now you could see that this is not even being used because this is grayed out. Remember what I said, a method just waits for you to use it. So to use a method, we need to call it from somewhere. In this case, we're going to call it from the main function because this is where our application starts. So when the application starts, we are going to add these numbers together and print it to the console. So in my main method, I will write add numbers. Whoop, and I see that there's a problem. I don't see add numbers, even though it's right here. The reason that I don't see it is because of this static keyword. Because this method is marked as static, I also need to mark this method as static. Now, again, same thing like private. Don't worry too much about static. I'm definitely going to explain this later on in the series. Just for now, we just have to write our methods like this. We have to put static. And so now I can write add numbers, and you see that add numbers now shows up. And if I call add numbers and I do my parentheses, I'm going to get an error. And the error is there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter num1 of program.addNumbers in int. When we created this method, we put these two parameters in here. That means that when we want to call the method to use it, we must include these parameters. This is not optional. We have to put two numbers in here. So I could put 2 and then a comma and then 4. And this is going to add the numbers 2 and 4. And again, I can, now I can call add numbers as many times as I want, and I can put whatever numbers I want, and every time I'm going to get the functionality. Now, this is only a one-line command, so it's not particularly useful here, but you can imagine that when there's multiple things that need to happen inside of this method, you can call it with one simple line and execute multiple lines of code every time consistently. So of course now if we run it, we'll see two values get outputted, 6 and 9. So now we see when we call add numbers, we print to the console the value of num1 that we get here. These basically get replaced, as you can see. Now, there's a better way to do this. When we add numbers, this method shouldn't really be responsible for printing out the value. It really should just tell us what the value is and let us do whatever we want with it. It's not really the job of the method add numbers to then also print to the console. It's kind of two different things. So what we can do is instead of void is change this to a return type. So we want to return an int. What we're doing is we're adding these two numbers together, and then we want to get an int back when we do so. So instead of console.writeLine, let me delete this and let me do return. So this special keyword return will send the value of num1 plus num2 back as an integer, because that's what we defined here. So this must be an integer. I can't return anything else. I can only return an integer. I'll get an error if I try to return something else, like, this string or something. I get an error, cannot convert string to int, because I can't return an int that's a string. That doesn't make sense. So we'll go back to num1 plus num2, and we get the return value. To use the return value, we can create variables from this return. So we can say int total, or total1, equals add numbers. And we could say int total2 equals add numbers. So we're assigning the value of total2 from the return of this method. So when we add 3 and 6 together, we want to return an integer of the value of 3 plus 6 or 2 plus 4 or any numbers we pass into here. And of course now I can console.writeLine and I'll put total1, and we'll just copy this real quick and do total2, and we'll see our value. So now this method is no longer responsible for actually printing anything to the console. We can handle that elsewhere. And maybe we want to do something else. Maybe we want to add these numbers together. We want to get this total, and then we want to say something like total equals total times 4, something like that, right? So now we want to get this value and then multiply it by 4 and set it equal to itself. So we get the value 6 when we add it together. Then we can do something else to it before we print it to the console. This is why return values can be very useful. We can get a value back from our method where we're using it, where we're calling the method. Then we can do whatever we want with it, and we can delegate who's going to do the work. So for example, I might even move this into another private static, but this one I'll make void, and we'll call this print total. And this wants to only take one value of a total, and here we will console.writeLine the total. All right, so now this method is simply responsible for printing the total. So what we could do, instead of doing any of this, let's get rid of this. Let's even get rid of this multiplier for a minute, and we can actually don't even need to set a variable, because all this method needs is a single integer that we pass into it. So we can actually pass in print total, and we can pass in the add numbers method, because this is going to return a single integer of num1 plus num2, and then we're going to print the total. So now all those lines that I created, I've now been able to change to this one single line, and I can change these values to whatever I want. See? And every time I write print total, it's going to print to the console. These methods are only responsible for what they need to be responsible for. All I need to know is that when I add numbers together, I'm going to get back an integer. Anytime I need to print something, I'll pass in the total I want to print, and I don't need a return type because I'm not returning anything. I'm simply printing to the console. The method is over. It continues on the program here. The last thing I want to show you real quick was that, of course, you can also create methods that don't have any parameters. So I could do static void print hello, and I don't have to put any parameters here, and I can just console.writeLine, and I could just put hello. So in this case, I'm not returning anything, and I don't really need to pass in anything because all I'm doing is just printing the word hello. So now I can just type print hello, and I don't need to pass in any parameters here. I can have empty parameters in a method and just let it do some work. I could even return something if I really wanted to. I don't need to pass anything in to get a return value if I had something that maybe made sense in this case. Another thing you can do with your parameters is you can set them to default values. So I could say int num1 equals 2 and int num2 equals 5. By setting these default values, I can choose to put numbers in here, or I can choose to put no numbers and the default will be used. I can also choose to use just one number, and what will end up happening is this will substitute for the first number, and the second number will use the default. So if I run that, the first number should say 8. Now the order of default parameters matters. I cannot set a default parameter before a parameter that does not have a default. So for example, this would be illegal. I can't do that, and you see I already get an error. But I can go the other way where I can set this and then set this equal to a default. So if I do have any defaults, anything to the right of the first default must all have a default value filled in. And in this case, 3, again, would only plug into the first value. And then if I chose to change it, I can put 8, and it will no longer be 5. It'll now be 8. Also, if I had 2 defaults, I could tell to use the second default by writing num2 colon, and then I can put something like 8. So this will use the default value for num1, which is 3, and set num2 equal to 8 instead of 5. So I can use this little colon here to do that. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is something called method overloading. And what that means is that we can create another method with the exact same name as long as the parameters are different. And what I mean is that the types, the data types that are used to make up these parameters, in this case 2 integers, must be different if I'm going to use the same name. So I can write private static int add numbers, and in this parameter I'm only going to put one number, and I'm going to return number plus number. So I'm only going to add it to itself. And I don't have a default parameter anymore on this num2, so this doesn't work for me anymore, so let's get rid of that. But see, now if I just put in a single number, I will now be calling this method, and 8 will add to itself 8 plus 8. If I want to put in 2 numbers, I can call the same method add numbers, but I can give it 2 different numbers. So I can use the same method add numbers to either add to itself or to add 2 different numbers together. And of course, this is just a simple little project, so as you build something a little more complex and the program grows, you might find that overloading methods has a little bit more value than just something as simple as adding numbers. But I just wanted to show it to you. It's useful to know you can create methods with the same signature, meaning the same return type and the same name, as long as the parameters are different. So hopefully by now you've picked up on something about methods. You've been using them all along. This console.writeLine, this writeLine is a method. It's available on the console class. In this case, this console is a class. Don't worry about that just yet. But inside of this console class, there is a method written called writeLine, which allows us to write to the console. Just like readLine is a method, just like main is a method of the program class. So something to note about methods, and this will apply to other things like properties and things we'll talk about in the future, is that there's a symbol associated with it in IntelliSense to help you find them. So if I just open IntelliSense and I'll just press any key and I'll backspace, we can still see the IntelliSense. All methods have this purple box icon. If we scroll through, you'll see all the purple boxes pop up eventually. There will be some. But we can filter by just pressing this, show only methods. This will show all the methods that are available to me from right here where I'm typing. This is context sensitive. There will be other times where you might see different methods in the list, depends on what you're trying to do. For example, right now, this is just inside the main method, and these are the only methods that I'm able to call directly. But what if I did, for example, console and look inside of there, and we just filter the methods, we'll see all the different methods that are available that have to do with the console. So just remember this little box here is for methods, and so when you're using IntelliSense, it can help you find what you're looking for if you're looking for a method. Just so you know, this wrench is for a property, and this lightning bolt is for an event. But don't worry about that right now. Just focus on the methods and this purple box. Alright, well that about wraps it up for this video. So we'll see you in the next video. Take care, hope you're having a good time, and we'll see you later.